So the class today is an introduction, a historical background to world order, the idea of world order, and also following that, looking at different types of world order in history or through history. So in international relations literature, scholars often start any discussion of international relations or world order by looking at Europe, especially the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, which marked the birth of the nation state. The term international relations comes from there, international relations. So this is about the nation state. The concept of a world order is different from international system in the sense that it doesn't only talk about nation states. The idea of a nation state with sovereignty, territorial integrity, the way we have since Westphalia and largely what we have in the world today, that's very new. It only goes back to less than 500 years. But the concept of world order includes other types of political units and not just nation states. You can talk about empires, you can talk about monarchy, you can talk about ancient republics, and then look at how they relate to each other and the relationship between them and among them and the overarching situation in the world at large. So let's just start by looking at the definition of world order. The term world order in the dictionary sense, and I quote from Macmillan English Dictionary, which defines world order as, in a very descriptive way, the political, economic, or social situation in the world at a particular time and the effect that this has on relationship between different countries. So it's a very simple descriptive definition. The situation, both political, economic, and social, of the world at a given time, and the effect this has on the relationship between different countries. But one of the problems with this definition is, what is the world? How far we go in looking at the world. Now, today when you talk about world order, you talk about the entire globe, close to 200 countries in Asia, Africa, Latin America, or North America, South America, Europe, Australia. But go back in history and let's say not even 2,000 or 3,000 years. Let's go back even 1,000 years. So what was the concept of world then? People in Europe did not know much about Asia. Certainly they did not know much about Africa. The Americas were not discovered, so-called discovered before Columbus. So world really meant a region or a continent. So the Europeans knew about each other. They knew a little bit about Asia, and they knew about China and maybe India. But there was no connectivity except the Silk Road and some maritime trade. So the world really meant a country or a civilization or a region, not the globe. So world order is therefore not global order. But you could still have a world order as long as a particular civilization or a country or let's say empire like China has a concept, a worldview, has a belief that it is the center of the world. And it has a view about what the world is like, the nature of political institutions and relationships around itself. So in that sense, there is a very good definition from Henry Kissinger, very helpful, not perfect, that defines world order as something that like a concept that is held by a region or a civilization about the nature of just arrangements and the distribution of power thought to be applicable to the entire world. This is from Kissinger's book, World Order, 2014. It's very helpful because, first of all, it doesn't say world order is same as global order. World order can be a region or a civilization. As long as that civilization or the region thinks it is the world, it is thinks its own institutions, its own principles of governance, its own way of managing relationships with other countries applies to the whole world. So go back to China. China from at least the Zhou dynasty, but certainly after the first empire of Qin dynasty, thought itself as the middle kingdom, center of the world. And it had its own conception of how to organize its own politics or own social system, and also how to organize its relationship with the rest of the world, with its neighbors. So you have concepts like all under heaven, Tianxia. Very interesting, all under heaven. This is not just about a nation or a country, but all. And then later on, the tributary system, which China at the center and the neighboring countries are tributary states, which pay respect to China, recognize China's cultural superiority, if not political sovereignty over them. And then the relationship is therefore a hierarchical relationship. And Chinese believes that this concept applies to the whole world. So some people interpret the concept of Tianxia, all under heaven, as not about the state. The unit of Tianxia is not the state. The unit is the world. So that's a good definition of world order. And you can find that everywhere. You can find that similar concepts of world order. They don't call it world order, but again, a sense of a political institution and relationships around it that a country or a civilization thinks applies to all of world. You can find that with Egyptians, Sumerians. You can find that with Indians. You can find that also with the Greeks. And by the time of the Romans, there was much more understanding that the world was bigger than just like what the Chinese thought of their own world in the, Zhou dynasty or warring states. But still, everybody, all the civilizations, including Roman, including Sumerian, Egyptian, Indian, Chinese, and later on Islamic, they thought their arrangements, their political institutions have a universal validity. They apply to other parts of the world, even though they did not claim sovereignty over everybody else. So therefore, world order is a concept, it's a civilizational concept, and it's not about nation states. It can apply to pre-nation state political systems like empire, monarchy, or republics of the ancient world. Ancient world also had republics, not just empires or monarchies, like the Greek city-states, for example, or the Roman Republic. India has republics which did not have a hereditary king. So they also had empires. They also had different stages in history, kingship. All of them can be considered as world orders, but not international systems, strictly speaking. Because the international system comes back to the nation state with sovereignty, territory. It's a more modern concept. Even though some scholars do apply international system backwards, and they say Greece was an international system. Maybe it was because it was had a lot of city-states, but they also apply that to empires. Like China was an international system, tributary system was an international system, and India had, after or before and after the Maurya Empire was a international system. But that's kind of stretching the concept of international too much. You are just using a modern concept and projecting it backwards in history to an ancient period, and it doesn't fit. So I think the term world order is a better fit, as long as you understand that it's not about the whole world, it's not the global order, and it can accommodate very different types of international systems. Very different types of political systems, including monarchy, republic, empire, and you can bring in the Greek democracy, although Greek democracy was not what the modern democracy looks like. So this is a concept of world order and a concept of how it is different from international system. So I want to talk about some classical international systems. And classical here I broadly define as anything that existed before the rise of the West, before the colonial period, really, before the advent of European colonialism, which started, as you know, with Columbus in the Americas. Vasco da Gama from Portugal came to India, and slowly the colonial period started. But even in the early stages of the colonial period, we still had empires, and we still have very powerful empires in Asia, like the Ottoman Empire, the Mughal Empire in India. We had the Chinese, at that time would be Ming, after that Qing dynasty. But Europe did not become fully sort of master of the world until much later, 18th century maybe. But they were rising. Europe was rising while other empires existed, and slowly the other empires like the Indian, Chinese, and the Ottoman Empire started declining relative to Europe. But everything that I call classical is before the rise of the West. Let's say before the 17th century, a rough kind of classification of periodization. So during that period, we have a number of world orders in the way I defined it. So the Sumerians, the Egyptians, the Chinese, Indians, Islam, but also in the Mesoamerican area, like the Maya civilization, the Incas in what is today Peru and Andes, and Aztecs. We have a number of different civilizations in different parts of the world. They don't necessarily know each other. Nobody knew about the Mayas and the Incas until Columbus and the Spaniards conquered these cultures. But at least they existed. But the most important ones that, in my view, because they had a global, they had a kind of a transcontinental imprint. I'm talking about 4 world orders here, really. Sumerians and Chinese, Indian, and Islam. Because they had a global, not a global, but transcontinental impact. So they struggled, like the Sumerians had an impact with the relationship with the Egyptians, and then they had they affected the Mediterranean civilization, including Greece. And another example would be Persia, which I'm not dealing with in this lecture, but Persia also, which is today's Iran, had an imprint on the Mediterranean, in the Egyptian world and the Greek world. And but together they constituted a very powerful, maybe the first world order that we can talk about. Then we have India, we have China, we have Islam. I'm not going to talk in great detail about Greece and Rome, although they were important world orders in their own right, but so much has been written about them, so much has been said about them, that it's kind of redundant, because Greece and Rome have become kind of the ideal type in the Western mind about classical civilizations and classical world orders. So when people talk about anarchy or decentered world orders, they talk about the Greek city-states. When they talk about empire, they talk about the Roman Empire. And between them, they sort of define the Western idea of what is a world order. But that leaves out all the non-sort of Western, Oriental civilizations of Sumerians or the Near East. Near East is a better term because that includes Persia, they include Sumerian, Mesopotamia, and Egyptian, and their interactions, as well as Greece, because Greece had a lot of its own people, a lot of Greeks settled in sort of what is today called Asia, in the Anatolia coast of modern Turkey. So that was often neglected. India, China, Islam also given very short attention. So because these civilizations have been excluded or actually ignored or kind of marginalized in our understanding of history, a Western understanding of history. I want to pay particular attention to them and compare them a little bit with Greece and Rome. And then we get a sense of what the ancient world orders were like and how they might be relevant to studying the world order that or orders we have since the rise of Europe. So starting with the Sumerian system, let me just start by telling you that the classical world order, again, we're not using international system, classical world order had different types of political units. So one was republic. So the Greek city-states were republics. India had a lot of republics before it became an empire under the Mauryas. And these republics were not like modern democracies, but the basic principle was there was no hereditary succession. Like, the ruler's children don't necessarily succeed the ruler. The succession is decided. In a sense, it's not by secret ballot. The Greeks did have a ballot system, but the succession is decided by the elite among with consultations and a selection process among the elite, who in some cases are citizens, some cases we can call them an oligarchy. So privileged, a small number of people in a state would decide succession, who becomes the ruler. And that's a republic. Republic is the opposite of a hereditary monarchy. So that was one form of political system. We had them in many parts of the world, including India and including the Greek city-states. The Roman Republic, before the Roman Empire, there was a Roman Republic and the like. Another political system was empire. So we had, after warring states, China becomes an empire. And a little before that, about 200 years before that, the Indian republics are defeated by the Mauryas, and the first Indian empire is created by the Mauryas. And of course, the Roman Empire is, after Roman Republic, from 1st century AD, becomes the grandest of the empires in the Western mind. And then you can go on. We had empires through in China from Han Dynasty to Tang Dynasty to Sung Dynasty, Ming Dynasty, before the Western colonial powers arrived in Asia. So that is another. Mongols were there also before the rise of Europe, a later stage in the classical period. So we had republics and we have empires. But the most common form of political system in the ancient world was the monarchy. There were empires and there were republics, but really the most common form of political system was a monarchy. And we call them a universal monarchy because of two reasons. One is that the ruler, or the king or the queen, in most cases was a king, a male, claimed to have a divine origin or divine sanction. And because of that, the ruler saw himself or herself as universal, meaning that its mandate was universal. India has a good term for it. In India, in the ancient India, it was called Chakravartin, universal conqueror, the conqueror of the whole world. But in China, if you look at the mandate of heaven, the son of heaven, it's also a sense of a universal monarchy. The Chinese, until the advent of Buddhism, simply did not have the idea that there was a world out there, at least based on available evidence. So only after Buddhism the Chinese realized that there is actually a country called India, there is Rome, and China is not the only civilization or country in the world. And Buddhism really did not come to China until the Eastern Han Dynasty. So the universal monarchy, in which the ruler thought of himself or herself as the lord of the universe, really, with a divine sanction, is really the most common form of political institution of the ancient world. And I dare say that if you look through history, it is the most common form of international system throughout in the long durée of history. The one exception, another, not exception, but another form of political system would be democracy. And people associate democracy with Greek city-states. But really, Greek democracy was really not a democracy in the modern sense. It was an oligarchy, which was limited to citizens. And for example, in 431 BC, out of a population of 315,000 of Athens, only 40,000 were citizens. It's a very small number actually had the right to choose, and there are choose the ruler or so-called vote or participate in the justice system. And in that sense, it was not a real democracy with the universal suffrage. But we have to count that as one form of our political system. But if you compare and look at all of this, empire, republic, democracy, and monarchy or universal monarchy with divine sanction, is the last one, monarchy. That was most common. And if you talk about anything universal from the ancient world, that was it. So the Sumerians, who invented that universal monarchy, some people call it universal monarchy, some people call it divine monarchy, whatever. Who invented that? It was really the Sumerians who invented it. And of course, the Egyptians also had a similar system, so we can quarrel about who was the first. Let's say it's a Sumerian-Egyptian kind of a construct. And you can also, we can call it the Near East. The region would be Near East. And Persia also had an empire, by the way, and a kingship, great king. But Persia also had an empire after Cyrus the Great. But really, on Persia, we can include it part of the Near East. So Near East where this particular form of political organization actually began. And in the case of Sumerians, of course, Sumer and Mesopotamia, that area went through different phases of history. But one interesting part of that was this idea that the ruler was not totally absolute. The main function of the king or the ruler is to arbitrate among fellow rulers rather than lord over them. So it was kind of decentered, that whoever was the ruler, king, his main function was arbitration rather than overlordship or ruling over others in the way other kings and queens would do later on or in other parts of the world. So the institution of universal kingship in Sumer was about giving the role of dispute settler to the king. And the Sumerians also had a lot of other innovations. There was, of course, the priestly class which dominated political life in Babylon a little later, towards the first millennium BC. But really, it was a very diverse system. There were, small empires, and the Persian Empire became important in the first millennium BC. But there was a combination of divine monarchy, republic, empire, and different types of mandate. Whoever had the empire, like the Persian great king after Cyrus, was really like an empire. It was the largest empire of that period, the Persian Empire. Cyrus, Darius, and they got into fights with Greece. They conquered Greek city-states in Anatolia, which is modern-day Turkey, and then Persians tried to cross over to the Greek heartland, but they were defeated by the Greeks. But they retrenched, but they never disappeared. They also continued to intervene in Greek affairs by supporting, for example, some states against others, like the Persian supported Sparta against Athens and got Athens defeated in the Peloponnesian, after the Peloponnesian War. So it was a very diffuse system, and I would like to call it a decentralized system. It's not like the kind of absolute empire of the Romans or the Chinese or the Indians under the Maurya, but certainly much more diffuse, not much more disparate. So it's kind of more of a anarchic world rather than a hierarchical world. So the key point here is you cannot stereotype and generalize that the ancient world had only one type of system. It had multiple types of systems through history. And it was not always an empire. It was also anarchic. Anarchic doesn't here mean violence. It simply means no higher authority above the political units. So you can see that the element of anarchy existed in Sumer. It existed in also India, in Greece. And then also there were empires and universal monarchies at the same time, which are more of a hierarchical system. So you can look at the situation in Mesopotamia in 3rd millennium BC. You had a number of states, but here is the Sumer. Sumer was the kind of a dominant civilization, really. Then you come down to the 2nd millennium BC, and you see a relationship develops among the states of the region, which includes Egypt, Assyria, Mesopotamia surrounding Babylon, and the Hatti and the like. The reason why we have to look at this is because they constituted a kind of a order. Again, I don't want to use the term international, but there are multiple units, kingdoms, which are interacting. There was interdependence and interaction among them. So when you talk about a world order, you have to also understand it's not just about a single political unit living or functioning by itself. We also have to look at international interdependence, or interstate interdependence, relationship among different states. And that's not a modern thing, by the way. Relationships, diplomacy, warfare, cooperation, peacemaking, treaty making, all happened in the ancient world. And one such very sophisticated system was called the Amarna period, because it was an international system in the 2nd millennium BC, that's the middle of 2nd millennium BC, where it brought together several of major players of that period, including Egypt and Assyria, or Assur, and Babylon in Mesopotamia, and the Hatti and other kingdoms. So a lot of work has been done on this, and it's well before the Greek city-states, well before the Roman Empire. It maybe some people call it the first real world order. Even some people call it the first real international system, because there was no overarching empire above this. Although Egypt played the role of a kind of a hegemonic power, but it was not a kind of a controlling. It was not an empire over the Sumerians per se. It was just the first among the equals. So you can see that if you study the classical period, you'll find some points of reference to something that we talk about later. It's not all about only the Peace of Westphalia beginning an international system of anarchy. You also had similar systems in the ancient world. Not quite the same, but similar, with tendency towards anarchy, tendency towards interaction, and anarchy, again, not meaning violence, but not having a central overarching authority. So a decentered system, basically. We had them in Sumer, we had them in India before the Mauryas, we had them in China before the First Empire. This is very common. So point I'm making is that there is no reason to say that everything started in 1648 in Europe, the modern international relations. We have to also study the previous periods and previous other cultures to see that there were also similar systems, not exactly the same, but it was not all about empire. So a lot of Western scholars think that West is kind of more democratic at home and decentered internationally. And the East is always more hierarchical, more imperial, and more authoritarian or absolute. The Oriental despotism is a term. But we can see that the Eastern systems also had tendencies towards anarchy and towards republic, and even when there were monarchies, they were not functioning as absolute monarchies, but the king was functioning as a dispute settler. So there's wide variation between within the non-Western civilizations of that period. You cannot stereotype them that they're all absolutist, all despotic, and all sort of empires, whereas and because of that, we cannot bring them in to study modern international relations. You have to study them because there's a lot of diversity, and you'll find that by looking at the differences among different civilizations during that period, you have a better understanding of the diversity of world history or global history. What about Greece? Now, Greece gets a lot of attention from political scientists and international relations scholars because people think Greece was the birthplace of democracy, so kind of non-monarchical, non-absolutist political system, domestic political system. And Greek city-states were the original model of international anarchy, which means they were kind of a precursor to Westphalia. Because after the Peace of Westphalia in 1648 basically settled the religious wars of Europe at that time, and the major outcome of that peace was that from now on, the states of Europe, including their monarchies or other types of political systems, will not have to acknowledge the superiority of the Pope or the Holy Roman Empire. And even nominally, that they should not have authority over themselves, but they will obey the authority of the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor. So that's why we think people tend to think that the birth of the modern international system started with Westphalia. But if you go back in history, they think, at least the Western historians, in most cases, they look at Greece. And Greece had this city-state system, which they consider as democratic. And the international system of Greece was similar to Westphalia of that period. So city-states and anarchy. Only Athens tried to be empire, but was defeated in the Peloponnesian War. So no Greek state created a universal empire. Rome did that later, but Greek city-states did not. So Western historians and political scientists always go back to Greece and think Greece was the first democracy, that's domestic decentralization, and Greece was the first international system because Greek city-states maintained this anarchic relationship. But I have just told you that that was not the case. We had republics and empires and different types of political system in the rest of the world, at least in Asia, and also we had international anarchic systems in other parts of the world. But Greece still gets a lot of attention. However, Greek democracy was a limited one, and Greece was not only its master of its own destiny. In fact, there's a very interesting term called Greco-Persia, Greece and Persia. Persia always played an important role, most of the time, in Greek politics. So Persians failed to conquer the Greek heartland. They were defeated by a coalition of Greek city-states, including Athens and Sparta, in the Battle of Marathon. But even after that, the Persians, they did not try to take over Greece, or the Greek heartland, but they maintained an influence. Of course, a lot of Greek settlements in the Anatolia coast were under Persian Empire, and some of them, by the way, preferred Persian rule to Greek rule. One thing about Persia, ancient Persia, the empires of Cyrus and Darius, is that they're very tolerant. The idea of human rights we talk about, idea of religious tolerance, is actually practiced. In fact, you can go back and there is evidence, both archaeological and otherwise, in the classical literature, that the Persian rulers like Cyrus and Darius, they practiced a religious tolerance. So that means, Cyrus, for example, allowed the Jews who have been conquered by the king of Babylon and brought into Babylon. Cyrus the Great actually allowed the Jews to return to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple, which had been destroyed by the Babylonian king. And at least technically, the Persians at that time did not allow slavery. Technically, they had kind of course, slavery was a commonly accepted institution, but the Persians at different stages actually did not legally allow slavery. And the idea of people talk about human rights. Some people think that the idea of human rights goes back to that Persian period of Cyrus and Darius, rather than to the Magna Carta in Britain much later. So the same Persians also had a controlling influence over Greek geopolitics. Even though they could not control Greece, they could not absorb Greece into Persian Empire beyond the coastal states of Anatolia, or Greek colonies of Anatolia. But they certainly interfered in Greek politics. That's why we call it Greco-Persia. So finally, it was the Persian help to Sparta that defeated Athens. So Athenian hegemony disappeared, Athenian power disappeared because they were defeated by Sparta, which is the other major Greek city-states, but the Spartans could not have done this without Persian support. Again, why am I talking about this? Because my sense is that Greece gets a lot of attention as the source of modern politics and international relations. You never heard about Persia. You never hear about what Persians did to the Greek city system. In fact, until I started teaching this course, I did not know the Persians actually had such an important role. I thought we all think after Persians were defeated in the Battle of Marathon, they just disappeared. But no, they did not. They continued to play a role in Greek politics, and they imposed the king's peace in 4th century BC to manage the relationship among the Greeks. So I guess the point here would be, don't think of Greece as the source of everything. I think Greece is important, but it's a role as the founder of a modern political system or international system is a bit overrated, and those of others has been underrated. And if you can look at the map of Greece, you can find that there was a widespread dispersion of Greek people because what they call colonization. Colonization is not just go and conquer other places, but simply migration. And a lot of them actually lived on what is today the coast of Anatolia coast of Persia. Anatolia coast of modern Turkey. So, for example, look at this. This area, Miletus in this map, and you can see they're all Greek settlements. Greeks were also in Sicily, they were in the Baltics, and the heartland, of course, was the city-states of Athens, Sparta, Corinth, and others. But a lot of Greek intellectual, philosophical, but scientific innovation happened in this area, which is today in Miletus. In Miletus, and today is the Anatolia coast, because this was closer to the Oriental civilizations of Persia, of Sumer, Mesopotamia, and Egypt. So it was easier for Greeks, and it was more likely that Greeks interacted with these civilizations and learned from them. So the Greek language came from Phoenicia, which is modern Lebanon. The Greek astronomy, the most famous Greek astronomer was Thales. He traveled to Egypt, and the Egyptians had already worked out the basics of astronomy that period. art, the Greek art was significantly influenced by that of the Near Eastern art. Before this contact between Greeks and the Near Eastern people civilizations, Greek art was more of a geometrical shape, although a lot of it was influenced by Egypt. The Greek human forms were basically based on the Egyptian models, the Greek archaic art based on the Egyptian model. But that the Greeks should take some credit for improving their own art and attaining a level of sophistication that gave them kind of a global reputation as pioneers of art, and that influenced Romans. But Greeks were also influenced by the Sumerians and the Persians in their art, and you can see that the geometric art of Greek changed to more with animals and flowers, and that was a distinct Oriental influence. Now, I must tell you that if you want to study ancient world politics, international relations, you have to bring in art, because we don't have too much evidence. We have literature of Greeks and Romans, but really art and politics are inseparable. You can see the diffusion of political ideas and institutions through art. So you have to get into a bit of art history. And another important story here, interesting story, is that Alexander the Great, who was Macedonian, although is associated with what is called Hellenization. Hellenization is basically about the spread of Greek culture before and after Alexander. So before Alexander, Greek culture spread because of migration throughout the Mediterranean to Sicily and the Italian coast in the west, and going up to the Anatolia coast on the east, and then the Baltics on the north. That was the spread of Greek culture. But after Alexander, also the Greek culture spread through Alexander's conquest. Now, the two phases are a little different, because before Alexander, what we call Hellenization happened because of migration, basically. When you say Greek colonization, it was not really going empire building. It was migration. Greeks settled in the coastal areas of Sicily, and they might have driven the coastal people, native people, to the interior, but they just established colonies. Here meaning settlements. After Alexander, and Alexander's conquest was not migration, it was by force. Defeating Egypt, defeating Persia, coming right up to India, to the Indus Valley. And it was a military conquest. And when Alexander died rather quickly, he left his generals to create kingdoms, what is called Hellenistic Kingdoms. And two of the most important ones were actually in Alexandria in Egypt, and Antioch in contemporary Syria, Syria-Turkey border. And there was also Macedonia had another Hellenistic kingdom. Now, the spread of Greek language, spread of Greek culture, spread of Greek science, Greek philosophy had a lot to do with Hellenization. But the means through which the Greeks did it was very different from what we know as a peaceful spread of ideas. Now, again, even in the first period, before Alexander, his conquest, when the Greeks migrated to Sicily, they displaced the local natives, and they absorbed them. They created city-states, small city-states. Some of them were tyrannies, some of them were a little more democratic. In places like in Sicily, for example, Syracuse is a good example of that. And then the Greek city-states started playing rivals, because all these colonies or settlements came from different city-states, from places like Athens, Sparta, Corinth. And when they settled in these areas, they reproduced their politics and geopolitics. And those little Greek settlements, they were for the Greeks, by the Greeks, and of the Greeks. They're not for the natives. They're not for the local people, like the original people living in Sicily. They were displaced, sent to the interior. Now, you can compare that with what happened in the case of India. India also had what is called Indianization or Sanskritization. When the Greeks were exporting their polis, which is the city-state model, Indians were also, maybe around the same time, maybe a little later, migrating to Southeast Asia, to what is today Malaya, Malaysia, Indonesia, and Thailand. Indians are also doing something similar, going out to settle. But you don't find many examples of Indian kingdoms in Southeast Asia which was ruled by Indians. Indians migrated, settled, but basically for trade. They established trade guilds, but the Southeast Asians themselves were interested in Indian culture. Whereas the Greeks went to Sicily, they established Greek city-states based on Greek ideas and under Greek rulership. When the Indians went to Southeast Asia, they went for trade, but they did not establish Indian sort of, in the sense, racial or ethnic sovereignty. What happened was the Southeast Asian rulers, they saw the Indian religion, especially Buddhism and Hinduism, and they said it's a great way to establish a lot of legitimacy. So they borrowed Indian ideas voluntarily. So therefore, they could appoint an Indian as the minister, advisor, sometimes get their daughters to marry an Indian trader or a priest. But the rulers are always local Southeast Asians, whether they're the ancestors of the Thais, for example, the Mons, or the ancestors of the Malays, or the Javanese. Cambodia is another example. Cambodia had successively Angkor, which was a Hindu-Buddhist kingdom. And they had a lot of Indian influence, but they were Cambodians, Khmer rulers. They're not Greek, like Greeks in Sicily. So those states of Southeast Asia that are influenced by India, they are for the locals, by the locals, and of the locals. Not for or by or of the Indians. Whereas where the Greeks migrated and established their entities, they're for the Greeks, by the Greeks, and of the Greeks. Two different modes of diffusion of ideas, which is very important to study of world order, because the study of world order is not just about war and peace, it's also about spread of culture. So in one case, culture of a migrating race basically displaces the local culture and creates, even though relatively peacefully, there were wars and conflicts, but there was nothing like the Alexandrian conquest. But the purpose was to create Greek outposts in other parts of the world. In the case of India, we don't have all the evidence, but general evidence is happened much more peacefully and was voluntary adaptation by the local rulers of Indian culture, rather than Indians creating their own outpost there. So when ideas spread, it can spread either through displacement of the local ideas and culture, or it can spread by voluntary adaptation, or what we call localization of foreign ideas and culture. So there are two models of spread of ideas. Very important to understand this, because today when we talk about spread of ideas and norms through the human rights, democracy, a lot of this happens not through outright conquest, but through localization and voluntary adaptation. And the Asian world, or the Oriental, or whatever you call it, the classical Asian world or Oriental world, provides more examples of peaceful adaptation or peaceful spread of ideas through voluntary acceptance of foreign ideas. Whereas Hellenization offers a model of spread of ideas through conquest or displacement. And of course, after Alexander, it was definitely, a lot of it was, Alexander was not going peacefully. He was conquering, and his successors established kingdoms. Of course, there were mixing and matching of Greek ideas with local ideas, especially in Alexandria. A lot of interaction between Greek and Egyptian beliefs and ideas. And it created a more cosmopolitan culture. But it was nothing comparable. The original vehicle for that spread of Greek, the Hellenistic, or what is called Hellenistic kingdoms, or Hellenization after Alexander, was conquest. But we don't really see any evidence of Indian conquest of Southeast Asia with the exception of military expeditions in the 11th century. Most historians believe that the spread of Indian ideas was much more peaceful. The spread of Greek ideas before, but certainly after Alexandra, was through conquest. So ideas can either spread through conquest and imposition and displacement of local ideas, or they can spread through peaceful means, through trade and commerce, and also by voluntary acceptance and adaptation by the locals. So there is a difference between the Greek polis and what we call the Sanskrit or the Indian cosmopolis, as a cosmopolitan idea that spread peacefully. International relations scholars should know that, because this is two different ways of spreading ideas and world order. Very relevant to contemporary world, because Samuel Huntington in early 1990s wrote an article, an American political scientist, Samuel Huntington, who passed away a few years ago. He said, he talked about a class of civilizations. The relations between civilization is of hostility and confrontation. But he was only talking about the contemporary period, and that's even problematic. But if you look through history, you can find that yes, civilizations clash, and ideas can spread through conflict, but civilizations also spread peacefully. The lot of interaction among civilizations is through mutual learning, voluntary adaptation. So you cannot find evidence for class of civilization exclusively through history. You can find evidence of peaceful spread of ideas. So the contrast between Hellenization and Indianization, between the Greek polis and its diffusion, and the Sanskrit cosmopolis and its diffusion, tells you two different types of spread of ideas and two different types of world orders. I think the Europeans later on, under colonial, if I dare say, make a generalization, the Europeans after colonial period basically adopted the Hellenization model. So the European ideas of nation state sovereignty, they were basically spread through conquest and colonization. And the Americans basically inherited that from Europe. So that's why it's fashionable to talk about class of civilization and forget this entire alternative history, alternative narrative, which is that ideas can spread peacefully. When Indian ideas came to China, for example, Buddhism and Buddhist institutions, it was almost entirely peaceful. There's no India-China war, like in Indian conquest of China, like Alexandra's conquest of Egypt. But Indian ideas, like Buddhism, became very powerful in China, precisely because it was voluntarily accepted by Chinese. If you look at the spread of Buddhism to China, it happened under the Eastern Han Dynasty. But it really took off after the collapse of the Han Dynasty. Because after the collapse of the Han Dynasty, the 3rd century AD, the Chinese lost faith with Confucianism, because the Han Dynasty was using Confucianism as a legitimate ideology. But when the empire collapsed, there was a lot of fragmentation, a lot of chaos, a lot of philosophical confusion, and the Chinese therefore wanted another set of ideas to give them a way out of this chaos. So Buddhism becomes very popular with the fall of the Han Dynasty. And then we have a period where Central Asian nomadic rulers, proto-Mongols, like the Northern Way, Beiwei, culture, very, very important for Northern Chinese history. They bring in Buddhism through the Silk Road. And they establish the capital first in what is today's Datong, and later on in Luoyang, which was also the capital of the Eastern Han Dynasty. And they spread Buddhism. And then under Tang, Buddhism becomes really almost like an official ideology under Wu Zetian, the only Chinese empress, with the only woman to be the emperor of China in history. So if you go to Luoyang, go to Longmen Grottos, you'll see her imprint. So, but all this happens peacefully, by the way. Generally, the transmission of ideas through the Silk Road. The Chinese monk Xuanzang, who went to India in the 7th century AD, goes there, learns, and the Indians make him the arbitrator of Buddhist conflicts. The Indian king Harsha appointed him as the chief judge of the dispute between the Hinayana and the Mahayana sects of Buddhism. A foreigner is given the highest position of arbitrator of what was at that time the most important religious dispute. Just give me a second, I will come back to you. So the Chinese accept ideas peacefully, voluntarily, and through China, Buddhism spreads to Korea, and then through Korea to Japan. And again, I don't see a lot of conflict or war here. So all I'm saying is that religious ideas, by the way, Buddhism, Hinduism are not just religious ideas, just like Greek. They're also political ideas, just like Christianity. They help to legitimize emperors. The Japanese emperors of Nara used Buddhism to legitimize themselves. Tang Dynasty used Buddhism to legitimize. Tang Dynasty also persecuted Buddhists later on, but at the beginning they used Buddhism to legitimize themselves. The Tang rulers, the Sui Dynasty in between, before Tang, which is a short-living dynasty, also very Buddhist. So all I'm saying is that religious ideas can spread, and religious and political ideas can spread through conquest and through peacefully. And we find that the Eastern model, if there is something we can call it as such, offers an alternative to the Hellenization model. And this is one advantage of studying civilization. Because if you go back in history, you'll find you have 5,000 history to play with, and rather than 500 years of history, if you study Westphalia and start your international relations from Westphalia, you have 500 or less than 500 years, during which you have one model that's dominant. The Westphalian model, ideas spreading through conquest, colonization. But if you study international relations from a long-term perspective, you find alternative ways. I'm not saying that civilizations do not clash, but I'm also saying that they also interact with each other peacefully. So let me just stop here and take some of your questions. And just one other example I would like to give is Alexander. When Alexander conquered Egypt, he did not try to create a Greek city-state, although Alexander was the pupil of a student of Aristotle. Now, there are different reasons why he didn't do that. Egypt is a different country. It's not easy to create political institutions of your own in another alien soil. But Alexander was attracted to this idea of a divine kingship, the pharaoh. He did the same thing when he came to Persia, conquered Persia, defeated the king, burned down the Persian capital. But he also did not create kind of a republic or a democracy. He anointed himself, he likened himself to the great king of Persia. So he was fascinated by the divine monarchy rather than universal monarchy, rather than any alternatives of democracy or any political system. So, again, that tells you that we sometimes give too much emphasis on the Greek model and Hellenization and too little about other types of political institutions and other types of internal systems and other types of spread of ideas. Even though you may like democracy, I'm not taking sides in the democracy versus monarchy debate here, that one is better than the other. All I'm saying is that through history, there are alternative political institutions, alternative ways of organizing the world orders. And this is why studying civilizations you'll find, a wide range of many of examples, models, which will inform you that the Western model is not universal or dominant through history. You might say Greek democracy was better, but let's accept that. But do you think the Hellenization through conquest of spread of ideas and displacement is better than the model of peaceful spread of ideas, which we find in the case of Buddhism and Hinduism out of India? So you have different ways of building world orders. And the Greco-Roman model, and Rome is another thing about empire, I'll come back to it, discuss it later. Roman Empire is considered the prototype of all good empires. Even the British Empire in India at one point was thinking of legitimizing itself by looking at the Romans did it, British will do it. The American leadership in the world. If you go to Washington, D.C., you'll find the major sculptures of American government, the major buildings of American government, like the U.S. Congress, and all modeled after Greco-Roman sculpture. Very much influenced by Roman Empire mindset, even though America calls itself not an empire. So we take that for granted as absolute universal, and we ignore this whole range of other possibilities where the other civilizations pioneered. So study of civilization tries to balance it out and moves you away from Eurocentrism, which starts with putting Greece and Rome on a pedestal and ignoring the contributions of other civilizations. So I will stop here briefly and we'll have a discussion.